Imagine being ruled by someone that's older than your grandparents, someone who's been president since before your parents were even born. And also, imagine watching your country's future shrink year after year after year while the same man wins again and again and again. 92 years old, 43 years in power. And still, he just won another election. This is Daylight About Africa. I'm your host, Numbe, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing Cameroon's 2025 presidential election, where Paul Biya, yes, the world's oldest head of state, has claimed yet another victory. We'll unpack what's actually happening on the ground, the protests, the anger, and the repression, but also what this moment says about the future of African leadership. Because when a country's median age is 19 and the president is 92, that's not just politics, that's a generational crisis. This episode is part of our Africa Now series, a pillar of this podcast where we look at what's happening right now across the continent. This includes the headlines, the hidden stories, and the human experiences, especially behind them. Because Africa isn't waiting for the world to notice, it's moving, building, and sometimes burning all at once. And understanding that reality matters. So over the course of this episode, we're going to break this down. Not just for those living in Cameroon, but for every African in the diaspora watching from abroad, wondering why change feels so far away. We'll start by walking through what's happened during the election, how Biya held on to power, and what it sparked in the streets. Then we'll talk about what actually keeps him there, why the youth are rebelling, and how the West, especially the West, still benefits from Africa's stagnation. And finally, we'll reflect on what this all means for us, the diaspora generation who says we want to help rebuild, but sometimes forget that rebuilding starts with understanding. So let's get into it, because Cameroon's story isn't just about one country's old ruler, it's a mirror reflecting why so many young Africans are feeling right now frustration, awakening, and a hunger for something new. So let's talk about what actually happened. So Cameroon held this presidential election on October 12th of 2025. And honestly, most people already knew how it would go. Paul Biya, the same president who's been in power since 1982, was running again at 92 years old. 92, y'all. Just put that into perspective. This man has been president since before the first iPhone came out, before Nelson Mandela was released from prison, before Beyonce was even born. He has seen the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of social media, and about 7 different US presidents come and go. And through all of that, he's still president of the same country. When the results were announced, the government said that Biya won about 53% of the votes, while his main opponent, Issa Chakormia Bakari, got around 35%. But Issa immediately rejected the results. He said they were fraudulent, that he'd actually won, and that the whole process was rigged and manipulated from the start. And that's when things started heating up. In Douala, Yaoundé, and Garoua, thousands of people poured into the streets. Some were chanting, others were waving flags, and a lot of them were just plain fed up. Security forces even came out fast with tear gas, water cannons, and even live ammunition in some places. And as of October 29th, 2025 today, at least 4 people have been killed and hundreds are being arrested. So if you followed Cameroonian politics for a while, this may sound familiar, right? Every few years, it's the same disputed elections, arrests, and international statements calling for peace and dialogue. France expressed concern, the UN asked for calm, and then life moves on. Except for ordinary Cameroonians, nothing really changes. And here's what makes this moment different, though. Most of the protesters were young, students, recent graduates, and market workers, people who've never known another president. If you're 22 years old right now, Biya has ruled for more than twice your lifetime. This frustration goes way beyond just one election. It's about having no jobs, underfunded schools, police corruption, daily insecurity, and a government that feels completely disconnected from what it means to be young in Cameroon today. So when they hear Biya's name announced again, it's like being told their votes and their futures do not matter, understandably. Online, the anger spread really fast too. They had Cameroonians at home and abroad posting videos, organizing on X and TikTok, comparing this to youth-led protests in places like Senegal and Congo. Some called it Cameroon's turn. Others said they're just tired of pretending things will change. And here's what I find kind of ironic. The government keeps saying that it's about maintaining stability, but for the youth, it feels like stagnation disguised as stability. So yes, protests have been happening and yes, the crackdown is real, but underneath all of that is something bigger, a generational disconnect. Young people do not see themselves in the system anymore, and that, more than anything, is what's fueling the fire. And after seeing all the protests and frustration on social media over the past couple of days, I kept asking myself, how did Cameroon even get here? Right? Like, how does a country end up with the same president for over 40 years and somehow the world just moves on like that's normal? And to really understand it, you have to go back a bit. Back to when Cameroon wasn't even Cameroon as we know it today. So what I think is important to know is that Cameroon was first colonized by Germany, but after World War One, it was split between France and Britain. That's why today you have this whole divide. There's a French-speaking majority and an English-speaking minority. And that split didn't just disappear after independence, it shaped everything. The French side got most of the resources, infrastructure, and political influence, while the British side was kind of sidelined. And when independence came in 1960 for French Cameroon and 1961 for the British administered part, leaders promised unity, but it was more like unity on France's terms. That tension between Francophone and Anglophone regions is still alive today. Now, let's fast forward to the early 1980s. The first president, Ahmadou Ahidjo, steps down in 1982 and his prime minister, Paul Biya, takes over. At first, people were hopeful. He was educated in France, soft-spoken, Catholic, and he was seen as like a modern technocrat who might bring change after 2 decades of strongman rule. But that did not last long. Ahidjo and Biya quickly clashed over power, and Biya won. After a failed coup attempt in 1984, Biya actually tightened his grip. He learned early on that survival meant control of the army, the media, and every major institution. So over time, his leadership turned into what people call presidential monarchy. Elections kept happening, but they were never really competitive. The ruling party, the Cameroon's People Democratic Movement, dominates everything from local councils to national TV. And to be fair, Biya's presidency hasn't been entirely one-dimensional. In the early years, there was some stability. Cameroon avoided the full-scale civil wars that hit some of its neighbors. There was a brief push for multi-party democracy in the 1990s, and he allowed it, but just enough to calm people down without ever risking losing control. Then the 2000s came, and Biya started adjusting the rules again, removing term limits from the constitution, reshuffling the cabinet constantly to keep his potential rivals weak, and relying on an aging elite who owe everything to him. It's like the entire system was built to make sure nothing moves on without his permission. And while all that was happening, the world around him changed completely. Cameroon's youth population exploded, social media arrived, economic inequality grew, but the government did not evolve with it. Corruption became normal. Infrastructure lagged and institutions lost their credibility. And remember the colonial divide I mentioned earlier before? It came back in full force around 2016 when English-speaking teachers and lawyers started protesting discrimination and lack of opportunity. The government responded with violence, and that's how the Anglophone crisis started, a conflict that is still going on today. Thousands have died, villages have been burned, and yet the leadership treats it like it's background noise. So when people say Biya has kept Cameroon stable, you have to ask, stable for who? For the elite? Sure. For the youth and the Anglophone regions and for those living paycheck to paycheck? Not really. The truth is, Biya's presidency is full of contradictions. He is praised for keeping peace, but criticized for silencing dissent. He's called the father of the nation by supporters and the ghost president by critics because he spends long stretches governing from luxury hotels abroad, barely showing up in public. And I think that's what makes this moment, this election, these protests so powerful, because people are not just angry that he won again. They're angry at everything that built this system. They're angry that colonization left behind a government model that rewards obedience over innovation, and that the same model is still running today, just with African faces at the top. So when young Cameroonians say enough, it's not just about Biya. I need you to keep that in mind. It's about decades of being told to wait for their turn in a system that was never designed to include them. Though that does not mean that we should not hold Biya and his cabinet accountable, okay? So after everything we just talked about, colonialism, Biya's rise, the old systems that never change, you start to see why Cameroonians are fed up, rightfully so. Because right now, Cameroon isn't just dealing with a political fatigue. It's dealing with a youth crisis. Over 60% of the population is under the age of 25. And young people aged 18 to 35 make up more than half of the country's workforce. Yet most of them cannot even find stable jobs. According to the World Bank, actually, nearly 50% of Cameroonian youth are either unemployed, underemployed, or stuck in the informal sector, hustling every day without contracts or any sorts of benefits. And while the official youth unemployment rate looks low on paper, about 6%, that number doesn't tell you the whole story. Most people do work, but they're doing jobs that barely pay enough to survive. So when you hear the word employment, it does not mean stability. It means survival. And that's the reality this generation grew up in. They've only known one president. They've watched the same faces run government, the same slogans repeat, the same promises vanish. And now they're saying enough. You can feel that energy everywhere. TikTok, X, WhatsApp, young Cameroonians, like I mentioned earlier, are documenting the protests themselves. They're recording these clashes, they're interviewing their peers, and they're posting updates in real time because they know national media won't cover it honestly, right? Some of them have also been using humor as resistance. I even saw a tweet, not super funny, but kind of funny. He was like, "Oh, my president has ruled longer than Wi-Fi has existed." Okay, it's a little funny, but it's also heartbreaking, right? Because it's true. But behind the jokes, there's anger. There's exhaustion. So when you listen to young Cameroonians, especially students, graduates, the vendors, you hear the same thing. We work hard, we dream, and still nothing moves. No wonder why people want to leave, right? And they're not just frustrated with Biya. They're frustrated with the system that was built before they were even born and hasn't even evolved since. And honestly, who wouldn't be? Imagine being 22, living in a digital world, watching your peers in other countries start businesses, elect younger leaders, and innovate while your own government feels stuck in another century. That's why this movement feels different. It's not organized like an old school political protest. It's not one party, one ideology, or one leader. It's emotional, cultural. It's a generation finding its voice after decades of being told to be quiet. And it's not just happening inside Cameroon, it's spreading to the diaspora. Cameroonians abroad are using their platforms to amplify what's happening, to educate people, to raise awareness. Because when you grow up hearing your parents say something like, "Don't get involved, it's dangerous," and then you watch videos of your peers risking their lives for justice, something in you shifts, right? And that's what's so powerful about Gen Z. They're not waiting for permission to care. They're using it as art, activism, and media to reclaim their story. They're not asking for the world to save them. They're asking for the world to see them. So when we call this a youth rebellion, it's not just about protests in the streets. It's about a generational mindset that is changing. Cameroon's young people at home and abroad are realizing they don't have to wait for someone else to define their future. And once a generation realizes that, there is no going back. So let's be real. Cameroon's story isn't just about Paul Biya and his government, though, like I said before, they should definitely be held accountable. It's also actually about the people outside Cameroon who have helped keep him there. Every time there's an election, every time violence breaks out, you'll notice the same pattern. The international community expresses concern and then moves on. France releases a statement saying it's watching the situation closely. The UN calls for dialogue, and then the US says that it values stability or something like that. That word, stability, it's the magic excuse, I want to say. It's what Western governments use to justify keeping long-term leaders in power as long as they're predictable and cooperative. Cameroon, by the way, like I mentioned before, is a former French colony, and France still holds deep influence there. Economically, politically, and even culturally. Their currency, CFA franc, is still tied to the French treasury. French companies operate in key sectors like energy, banking, and telecommunications. So, of course, France wants a government that keeps things orderly. Chaos is bad for business, and Biya delivers that. He's been a reliable partner. Cameroon hosts a French military presence, shares intelligence on counter-terrorism in the Sahel, and helps control migration routes. So, while Cameroonians are out protesting for change, the global narrative still paints Biya as the experienced elder salesman who keeps the region stable. It's the same double standard we've seen across Africa. When young Africans demand democracy, they're called radical or unrealistic. But when aging leaders overstay their time, overstay their welcome, the West calls them steady allies. That's why so many Africans, especially young ones, see Western support for democracy as performative. Because what they actually support is control. As long as their interests are safe, human rights become a side note. And it's not just government, it's the media too. When coverage of Cameroon appears in Western outlets, it's often framed as unrest or security threats. not around the human stories, the youth, the woman, the diaspora, the artists, the people actually shaping the country's future. It's frustrating because that's how the cycle of silence continues. The same narrative that started during colonial times, Africa as a place that needs guidance, still exists, just dressed up in diplomatic language. And look, I'm not saying foreign countries cause all of Cameroon's problems. Like I said 2 times, and I'm going to say it for the 3rd time again, the leaders need to be held accountable for their actions. But it's impossible to ignore how global systems still decide who gets legitimacy and who does not. Because if the West truly cared about democracy, it would care about what the youth are saying, not just about who controls the pipelines, the ports, or the peacekeeping bases. This is where the "they lied about Africa" part of this podcast really hits, because they did. They lied when they said Africa's instability is homegrown. They lied when they said old leaders stay in power because Africans aren't ready for democracy. What they don't say is that those same leaders are often propped up by international deals, loans, and quiet partnerships that keep everyone comfortable, except the people that are actually living there. So when Cameroonians take to the streets, they're not just fighting their own government, they're fighting a global system that benefits from their silence. So after watching everything unfold, the protests, the silence, the international hypocrisy, it's hard not to ask, so where do we fit in all of this, right? Because for many of us in the diaspora, this hits different. We might live in the US, in France, in the UK. When we see videos of young Cameroonians running from tear gas or chanting in the streets, something in us tightens. It's not just sympathy, it's familiarity. It's the feeling of watching home go through pain, knowing you still belong to it somehow. A lot of us were raised hearing our parents say, "Don't get involved in politics, it's dangerous." Or maybe, "You're lucky to be here, just focus on your life in the West. Go to school here, make your bread and stay here." And for a while that made sense, right? Our parents left countries like Cameroon to survive, not to start revolutions. But now, a new generation, our generation, is realizing that distance does not mean disconnection. We're seeing the same systems of power our parents fled, still running things decades later. And we're realizing that the story of Cameroon, and really of so many African nations, isn't just about bad leadership. It's about what happens when the world stops paying attention and when we, the diaspora, start thinking our voices do not matter. But they do. Think about it. Millions of Cameroonians live outside the country, in France, the US, Canada, across Africa. They send billions of francs home every year in the form of remittances. That's money that sustains families, funds educations, and keeps communities alive. That's power. But economic power means nothing if we also don't use our cultural and narrative power to speak, to amplify, to pressure, to educate, especially educate. And that doesn't always mean protesting or posting. It can mean using our platforms, whether that's a podcast, a small business, a classroom, to remind people that what's happening back home is not normal. It's also about staying informed, because if we only know Africa through crises, we'll never understand how to rebuild it. We won't. And when I see young Africans abroad creating content, starting organizations, or simply having conversations like this, I see hope. We're not disconnected. We're transforming how connection looks. We're realizing that being in the diaspora does not mean you are outside of Africa. Yes, you may be physically, but it means that you have a new vantage point to help shape its future. But it also means holding ourselves accountable. Because sometimes, even in the diaspora, we become comfortable. I catch myself lacking sometimes too. We start seeing home as this faraway place we can criticize but never contribute to. And that's something we have to unlearn. If we truly believe in change, it has to start with how we engage, how we talk about our countries, how we invest, and how we show up. And that's what this entire conversation about Cameroon represents. It's not just about one country or one election. It's about what happens when a new generation refuses to inherit silence. Cameroon's youth are showing us something powerful, even in the face of repression. They're refusing to give up on their future. The question is, though, will we, the diaspora, match their outrage with our consistency? So after all of this, the protest, the repression, and yet another victory for a 92-year-old president, the question that keeps echoing is simple. After Biya, then what? Because it's not just about the end of one man's rule. It's about what comes next. And that's the part we don't talk about enough. If Biya were to step down tomorrow, Cameroon wouldn't magically become free or fair overnight. The same institutions, the same networks, the same habits of power would still be there. That's what 40 plus years of one man's leadership looks like. It turns governance into muscle memory. So real change can't just be about removing a leader. It has to be about rebuilding the mindset that kept him there. And that's where this generation, both in Cameroon and across the diaspora, has a role to play. Because what's happening right now is bigger than politics. It's about how we define leadership, how we demand accountability, and how we refuse to settle for stability when it means stagnation. Cameroon's youth have already shown the world they're awake. They've seen too much, learned too much, and connected too deeply to go back to silence. And for those of us outside the continent, this moment is a reminder that it's not enough to just repost and move on. We have to stay engaged because the future of Africa won't just be decided by those who live there. It will also be shaped by those of us who care enough to stay involved no matter where we are. I want to close this up by thinking about something that I've heard someone once say. When a generation grows up knowing only one ruler, the most radical thing they can do is imagine something different. That's exactly what's happening right now. Cameroon's youth are imagining differently. That's where every revolution begins. So whether you're in Yaoundé, in Douala, or in Paris, or in Boston, or in Texas, or in California, wherever you are, the question isn't just, will Biya leave? It's, what kind of country are we ready to build when he finally does? Because at some point, every era ends. But what comes after depends on who's really ready to lead. This has been They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numbe. Until next week.